Thank you, Asma. And I just wanted to begin by adding my thanks to Reese and to Jackie, and especially to Wendy Wick-Reeves for organizing this event and creating the occasion for it. I also wanted to thank my fellow presenters for their fascinating papers. It's been intriguing to see all the overlaps that I wouldn't have expected between our different work. And I think my paper is going to continue the discussion of privacy and publicity that we were talking about in the last session's Q&A. In April of 1908, Samuel Langhorne Clemmons penned the following grumbling inscription beneath the photograph reproduced in a volume of short stories published in commemoration of his 67th birthday. Of course they would frontispiece it with this damned old libel, which began as a libel when Cerrone made it, and since which time it has been used all over the world in preference to any later and better picture. Clemmons' objection is intriguing, both because it makes clear that he was not consulted in his portrait selection, and also because his words did not address any specific living fan or admirer. Instead, they annotated his own personal copy of the souvenir book, residing quietly in his private library as a kind of message to the ages about the author's intense distaste for a photograph chosen to represent him and his writing. Clemmons' surviving papers are filled with similar handwritten marginalia, offering corrections, retorts, and pithy asides to those he correctly presumed would continue to seek out his words decades after his death. This compulsive editing can be attributed to the author's deep personal interest in managing reception of his own public image, the celebrity persona that was embodied by his fictional alter ego Mark Twain. Literary scholar Art Kent Rasmussen has suggested it was for this reason that the author invested his personal papers with such significance, regarding them not just as private mementos, but as, quote, mirrors reflecting the images Clemmons cast onto the world. The idea appeals in the context of this symposium because it underscores the complex connection between a specific portrait, like the one found in this book that you see up on the screen, and an individual's public image, which might be comprised from a multiplicity of pictures and texts existing in the realm of mass media and the popular imagination. In this sense, Clemmons' comments point to the origins of a phenomenon that we as citizens of the 21st century understand very well, which is that rapidly proliferating photographic images can very easily slip beyond individual editorial control. Even further, though, my paper today proposes that Clemmons' written words of protest, specifically his description of his photograph as a damned old libel, allows us to contemplate this pivot point in portraiture's history from the perspective of artist as well as subject. How, in other words, could a relatively innocuous-looking photograph pose a defamatory threat to the public image Clemmons guarded so closely? It was true at the time Clemmons wrote that the picture reproduced in his birthday book was not a particularly recent one. It had been created 15 years earlier in 1893 by Napoleon Cerrone, a Manhattan-based portraitist revered during the Gilded Age as the father of artistic photography in America. But I suggest his charge of libel had less to do with the portrait's appearance than with a significant change in how portrait images were displayed, appreciated, and consumed during the decades preceding the turn of the 20th century. Between the 1850s and 1900, photographic portraiture emerged as a major industry in the United States. At the start of this period, the introduction of small-scale paper photographs, such as carte de visite and cabinet cards, democratized access to the possibility of self-representation, sparking a consumer frenzy known popularly as cart-o-mania. By 1882, sales of photographic portraits totaled roughly $1 million in New York City alone. And this booming picture industry gave rise to a peculiar moment of conflict between two simultaneously evolving cultural phenomena: the emergence of modern mass media celebrity on the one hand, and the campaign to elevate photography to the status of fine art on the other. Both pursuits required novel strategies for asserting creative authority over individual intellectual property. For celebrities such as Samuel Clemmons, it meant attempting to maintain control of a professional public image that was increasingly open to collective definition. And for ambitious photographers like Cerrone, it meant persuading skeptical viewers that a medium conventionally associated with facile mechanical reproduction could function as a vehicle for personal artistic expression. Against this backdrop, I propose that Clemmons' claim of libel might be properly understood as a contest of authorship, a dispute between subject and artist over who could rightfully determine the meaning of a publicly circulated image. And certainly, based solely on appearances, it is difficult to discern what could have troubled Clemmons about this portrait so deeply. The author is pictured at bust length, with his shoulders angled slightly away from the camera, so that he seems to gaze at some point just beyond the viewer. The composition employs a lighting technique often described during the day as Cerrone lighting, because of its frequent use in the Cerrone studio. The side of the subject's face that is closest to the camera is cast in shadow, while the more distant side is brightly highlighted. The result here in this photo is that the author's jawline and the creases surrounding his right eye are softened by shadow, while on the other side of his face, radiant light delineates the contour of his cheek and accentuates the craggy furrows between his eyebrows. This tonal range lends sculptural solidity to Clemmons' photographed head and draws attention to the wild peaks and volume of his famous mane of graying hair. And at first, Clemmons seemed to have liked this photograph well enough. He gave his wife Livy a lovingly inscribed copy of it for her birthday the year that it was taken. And Cerrone certainly never expressed any awareness that his famous client was unhappy with the image. In fact, he frequently proclaimed this photograph of Clemmons to be among the best he'd ever taken. In an 1894 interview, Cerrone proudly recalled the circumstances of its creation. He said that one day while out walking on Fifth Avenue, he encountered the author in the street and was immediately struck by the appearance of Clemmons' iron gray hair tumbling over his coat collar and sticking out from under his hat. The effect, Cerrone said, gave the author's head, quote, the massive appearance of an old-style patriarch, end quote. Racing over to catch hold of the author's arm, Cerrone implored him, Mark Twain, I want you to let me take your head, just as it is. Several days later, Clemmons appeared in the photographic studio as requested, and Cerrone created a portrait that he felt was true to his vision of the author that day on the street. In his opinion, the picture lent Clemmons an air of gravitas and dignity while retaining a sense of his lively, cantankerous spirit. It is, Cerrone concluded, a photograph of which I am justly proud. Clemmons' view of the portrait was, of course, quite different after a time, and his objections were not limited to the quiet inscription I read earlier, but also in the years following Cerrone's death in 1896. Were forcefully and frequently repeated in a variety of public forums. In an open letter published in 1905 to an admirer who had requested an autographed copy of the photograph, the request was denied. Clemmons even insisted that he was not the portrait's true subject. Instead, he explained in characteristic deadpan that the photographer had for years been circulating a picture of a costumed gorilla in his place. Denying Cerrone's account of the picture's creation, Clemmons recalled that the photographer came to him one day in a state of great excitement to say that he had located the author's long-lost great-grandfather in an exhibit of lowland gorillas that was then touring the United States. I was deeply hurt, but did not reveal this, the author confided, because I knew that Cerrone was not a man who would say an unkind thing about a gorilla wantonly. Eager to facilitate a reunion, the photographer, by Clemmons' account, invited both author and ape to his portrait studio, and in order to demonstrate the family likeness, he borrowed Clemmons' overcoat and put it on the gorilla. Though at first he had been unable to see a resemblance between himself and the creature, Clemmons conceded that once the animal was in costume, the result was surprising. I saw that the gorilla, while not looking distinctly like me, was exactly what my great-grandfather would have looked like if I had had one, end quote. It was at that point that the troublesome seeds for so-called libel were sown. Clemmons reported that, quote, Cerrone photographed the creature dressed in that overcoat and spread the picture around the world. It turns up every week in some newspaper somewhere or another. It is not my favorite, but to my exasperation, it is everyone else's, end quote. The story of the gorilla imposter, though clearly meant to amuse, provides insight, I believe, into Clemmons' later charge of libel. The problem was not simply that the picture was unflattering, though clearly this was a part of it, but also, more frustratingly, that Cerrone had allowed his image to be spread around the world. And indeed, whether fueled by the photographer's pride or simply public enthusiasm for the portrait, Cerrone's portrait of Clemmons was reproduced widely during the decades following its creation, seeming to take on a life of its own once loosed in the realm of mass media. In addition to carte de visite and cabinet cards produced by the Cirone studio, the image was reproduced in countless newspapers, magazines, and books, and it served as the basis for popular illustrations, such as the chromolithographic label you see here that was pasted inside every box of Mark Twain brand cigars, a product that, like the portrait's other iterations, was circulated and sold without the author's consent. And in fairness to Cirone, I should add that most of the images you see here were pirated without his consent either. The author's biographer, Albert Bigelow Payne, recalling Clemmons' angry outbursts each time he spotted Cirone's offending portrait, later reflected, quote, "It was a good photograph, mechanically and even artistically, but it did not please Mark Twain," end quote. The substitution of Clemmons' real name with that of his creative alter ego is telling in this context. After all, Mark Twain was not simply a pseudonym, but also Clemmons' public self, and in many ways his most cherished work of fiction. Cirone's competing public image, which employed Cirone lighting and was boasted to be the best Cirone had ever created, effectively threatened to displace Clemmons from the authorial process. It was not, in other words, that the portrait was libelously false, but rather that it contradicted the carefully edited fictions Clemmons preferred be cast upon the world. Essentially, when he let the photographer take his head that day in 1893, he'd had no idea he'd be surrendering it completely. For Cirone, however, the goal was not to make a monkey of Mark Twain, so to speak, but rather to persuade skeptical period viewers that it was possible to exercise creative voice through the medium of photography. And his ability to embellish natural appearances with compelling photographic fictions was how he distinguished his work from earlier generations of photographers from the very start of his career. In 1866, Cirone introduced himself to the American public with a series of self-portrait photographs demonstrating his powers of invention by transforming his own public image, as well as his career, from that of unassuming New York City lithographer to debonair bohemian photographic artist. Surviving portraits from this period, which you see here, show him experimenting with an array of different personas, costumes, and poses, and especially hats, before settling on the look with which he became enduringly associated, which is the larger image you see on the left. Knee-high boots, a woolly shearling vest, and an astrakhan cap cocked at a jaunty angle. Today, these portraits appear quirky, though perhaps not extraordinarily so. But when they first circulated, his contemporaries described their impact as being, quote, like a meteor from a clear sky, end quote. With his unapologetically eccentric look, Cirone presented himself publicly in the role of artist, and to many in the American photographic community who had been reluctant to take on this role, the act seemed to point the way toward a new and more expressive avenue of creative practice. Recalling his first glimpse of the self-portraits, one of Cirone's contemporaries wrote, quote, how he raved over his work and effects and wondered what secret process he used, forgetting it was the man and not the process that was responsible for the results. Though this myth of individual authorship is one Cirone himself liked to promote, there is much evidence to suggest that his process and the period definition of artistic photography he helped establish might be better described as a kind of performative collaboration. I base this in part on an unpublished photograph I discovered during the course of my book research, which you see here on the left, that I'm excited to share here publicly for the first time. This image, taken around 1866 in Cirone's first professional studio in Birmingham, England, depicts his wife, Louise Cirone, trying on the pose and costume for which her husband later became famous, perhaps as a means of helping him develop his final look. This portrait likely was not publicly circulated, and unfortunately no studio records survived to shed light on the circumstances of its creation. But its existence seems to document a private photographic event approached with the playful aim of defying the rigid conventions that were used to stage individual and gender identity during the period. And it suggests that Cirone's nonchalant bohemian pose was actually the result of careful thought and collaborative experimentation. This performative working method conforms with later descriptions of Cirone's studio that were recorded in period newspapers. One such story involves a series of photographs taken in 1868 of the Italian actress Adelaide Ristori in the role of Marie Antoinette. Although the session began like any other, with the actress in costume enacting scenes before the camera, witnesses reported that Cerrone and Ristori gradually seemed to enter a kind of shared trance brought about by their photographic collaboration. While the actors performed and the photographer encouraged, suggesting poses and signaling for exposures to be made, the pair became absorbed in the reenactment of Marie Antoinette's final moments. At the height of her performance, the actress tore the wig and bonnet from her costume and cast them aside. And you can see them here in the lower foreground of these photographs. And the photographer, forgetting himself completely, toppled backwards from the posing platform and fell with a crash, breaking the spell that had gripped the studio. When he was asked afterward to explain what happened, Cerrone could only recall the powerful communion that had existed between himself and his subject, saying, quote, "Why, I actually saw Marie Antoinette before me and not her mimic. I have the negative to prove it," end quote. The statement offers insight to his ambition for photography and the potential he recognized in performance to elevate the work he created. After all, his point seems to be that portraits were not simply reproductions of an actress mimicking a character, but instead captured the grander artistic potential of theater and of photography to temporarily transform a viewer's perception of reality. In some cases, however, the fictions of Cerrone's studio threatened to subsume the identity of his sitters. His portraits of the actress Maud Branscombe, for example, sparked minor international furor in 1880 when they suddenly flooded the celebrity portrait market. Branscombe was an unknown actress at the time who'd gone overlooked on the New York City stage until she became the muse of Cerrone's studio. Her portraits reveal the kaleidoscopic results of another instance of costumed role play. Branscombe appears with her hair up and hair down, in ribbons and plumed hats, in a nun's wimple and jeweled headdresses. And in an era before the widespread appearance of fashion models, there was little framework for understanding commercially circulated portraits of relatively anonymous individuals. And so the identity of this mysterious beauty became the subject of feverish speculation. One Parisian newspaper concocted a biography based on Cerrone's images that was the stuff of contemporary melodrama. It involved a string of jilted lovers, an abandoned baby, a stint as a dancer in a California gold mining camp. Fueling the intrigue was the fact that Maud, the individual, could not hope to match the market demand for her public image. Though her photograph was readily available through print shops and street vendors, Maud herself apparently could not be located for comment. A New York Times reporter described this conundrum in an article titled, "Maud Branscombe, a woman whom nobody knows," and wrote wistfully that, quote, "Maud's portrait is everywhere, Maud is nowhere." And indeed, the hundreds of extant photographs of Maud Branscombe provide more insight into the staging practices of 19th century portrait studios than they do about this individual woman's identity. And even at the time when Branscombe at last stepped forward to collect upon her newfound fame, it was widely reported that she did not live up to the beauty of her portraits. One disenchanted admirer complained, quote, "The photographs did it. They pictured a feminine face so close to artistic ideality as to arouse marvel. The Maud Branscombe of real life was a diminutive, colorless little woman with a fine profile, and that was all," end quote. Yeah, sad. Though poor Branscombe was caught in an unfortunate gap between real life and photographic fiction, Cerrone's most lasting contribution to American photography was an expanding recognition that there was a meaningful distance between the two. This accomplishment was ratified in 1884 by Cerrone's victory in the landmark Supreme Court copyright case, Burrow-Giles Lithographic Company v. Cerrone, which created the first precedent for the recognition of photography as art. The suit arose when one of Cerrone's portraits of Oscar Wilde, which you see here on the left, was reproduced without permission as the basis for trade cards advertising the Eric Brothers department store. When Cerrone sued for breach of copyright, the lithographic company did not bother to deny they had used his photograph, since it was plain that they had. Instead, they challenged his more fundamental right to claim authorship of his work by suggesting that a photographic image actually contained no original content. After all, they argued, Cerrone had not invented Oscar Wilde, he had only reproduced his likeness. Cerrone countered that he had no wish to claim he invented his subject, but he had invented a visual framework that was instrumental to the way Wilde appeared in his public image. According to court documents, Cerrone and his lawyers proposed that the pose, expression, and setting of the portrait all had been created, quote, entirely from Cerrone's own mental conception, to which he gave visible form, end quote. By posing wild in front of the camera, selecting and arranging the costume, suggesting and evoking the desired expression. In its ultimate ruling, the Supreme Court agreed, writing that Cerrone's visible intervention in the photographic process elevated his portrait beyond mere mechanical reproduction to what they called, quote, ideas in the mind of the author given visible expression, end quote. Though most at the time appeared to find this photographic author's ideas to be an improvement upon reality, Samuel Clemmons was less willing to relinquish creative control of his self-representation. Considering his harsh reaction to the appearance of Cerrone's photograph in his 67th birthday volume, it is interesting to consider in closing a self-portrait caricature he created for circulation at this same event. Etched on a copper plate, this image was presented as a gift to the distinguished guests who attended his party. And the copy that you see here is actually from the John White Alexander papers, from what he received at the party. Though the drawing is sketchy in form, the self-portrait bears striking resemblance to Cerrone's photograph in the details that it does include. The peaks and projections of the hair, the carefully delineated details on the left side of face, and the soft shadowed jawline on the other. It's almost as if the caricature attempts to reclaim control of Cerrone's ubiquitous photograph by re-authoring it in the hand of Mark Twain. One striking difference, of course, is that the Clemmons caricature has been drawn without a mouth, an omission that renders the author uncharacteristically speechless. An inscription that's contained protectively within the outline of the figure's torso simultaneously offers explanation and claims the last word in describing the picture's appearance. Quote, I cannot make a good mouth, therefore leave it out. There is enough without it anyway, end quote. Enough, that is, to cast an image on the world that referred insistently back to Clemmons as the authoritative voice in determining his public image's meaning. What this points to, I propose, as an area deserving further exploration, is what photographic portraiture makes visible about the collaborative encounters underlying portrait images in all media. Portraiture is an inherently theatrical genre, requiring that a subject's identity be staged for public consumption. Although the precise negotiations between photographer and subject have not always been preserved, the visual record can nonetheless contain durable traces of the collaboration underlying the portrait process, or in the case of Cerrone's libelous portrait of Samuel Clemmons, represent a lasting representation of its refusal. Thank you.